Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanne Burnett. My pronouns are she, her, and I describe myself as a brown-haired Caucasian female. And I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the co-chair for the 2022 Campus to Career Conference here at Stetson. And I want to acknowledge the other co-chairs that have been instrumental in bringing all of our programs together. And that is Jenna Kelly in the Office of Student Affairs, Professor Bobby Flowers, Professor Kristen Adams, Kathy Martin, Assistant Dean of Career and Professional Development, and 3L Joseph Kim. All of this entire group has worked really hard to put on a fantastic lineup of programs that started earlier this week and will continue through at least the first half of April. So I encourage you to, I'll share later in the chat, I encourage you to check out the other programs slated in the Campus to Career lineup. We have programs pretty much every day from now until April 14th, and they are all designed to bring to you important skills, perspectives, insight, and career communities that will help you transition from campus to career. So I also want to acknowledge our sponsors. We always want to thank our sponsors, Baker McKenzie, Holland & Knight, and Quarles & Brady for their support of the conference. I'm really excited that you all are here today. And I'm really appreciative of Lambda for co-sponsoring this program with us. I think we're going to have a really important conversation today, and I'm excited about our panelists, and I'm excited about our moderator, who I will introduce to you in just a moment. I will share our speaker bios in the chat because I want us to get right into the conversation. But before we get into the conversation, I want to share a little bit about what this program is and what this program is not. So again, I am glad that you all are here. I think we are all in various stages of learning and appreciating differences and learning how to be the best advocates that we can be. And there are many useful resources available that discuss the idea of bystander intervention. And specifically, there is a lot of scholarship that discusses intervening in instances of physical abuse or violence. That discussion is a valuable one, but one that is outside the scope of what we will discuss today. Today, we want to focus on building a toolbox for advocating when we find ourselves in or witnessing a discussion that would benefit from our insight, perspective, and allyship. Tools that we can use to move the conversation forward in a meaningful and productive way. And we have some wonderful perspectives represented here today, but this program does not purport to represent all communities. Rather, today's focus is on skill building. So we will be recording the substantive program of this conversation, and then when there's time for Q&A, we will turn off the recording so that people can feel free to maybe perhaps feel more comfortable in asking their questions. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to you Hunter Wolf. Hunter is a 1L here at Stetson, and she serves as the 1L representative for Lambda Legal, and she also is a member of the SBA Diversity Committee. And Hunter is going to be moderating our conversation with Carmen Johnson and with Nathan Broomer, both alums of the College of Law. You're going to hear a little bit more about them in just a minute. But again, I want to thank you all for being here. I think this is a great conversation. I'm excited you're here, and now I am happy to turn it over to Hunter. Hunter?
Hey, everybody. I'm also really excited to be here. We do have a lot of content, so I just want to jump into things. My first question is going to be for both of our panelists today. Kind of a two-parter here. What made you want to go to law school? And then was your vision for yourself what you thought you would be doing today?
And Nathan, thank you so much for being so kind. Hello, everyone. My name is Carmen Johnson. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you, Hunter, for moderating. And also very quickly, I wanted to thank the Campus to Career Steering Committee for this outstanding program. I've been able to attend several events and just remain impressed with the quality of the programming for all of us. So very quickly, my path to law school was a little unique in the context of I started out as a science major in college and was in love with research, didn't necessarily want to go into medical route, just wanted to be in research. But what I found throughout college, I was down in Miami for my college experience. I found that I fell in love with the higher ed community, in general, and not necessarily the science and the molecules that made up the people, but just the people and engagements in between people within a space like higher education. So a lot of my mentors in college were lawyers themselves, and that was what slowly guided me to going to law school. In terms of the latter part of the question, did I see myself in this space? Not in this exact context. The work that I do has grown over time. My love for the work has grown over time as I've gained a little bit more knowledge. Stetson University was founded in 1883. The university as a whole, of course, the law school was in 1900. And that was 1883, about 18 years after the Civil War. So in the context of the work that I'm doing and looking at historic structures within a university environment, didn't necessarily see myself doing it here at Stetson, but the opportunity presented itself, and it is absolutely a pleasure to be able to do it.
Thank you. I know we love having you here. Nathan, same question.
Yeah, great question. So my path to law school was a meandering path that took a moment. But I don't think I thought about it until high school, and I wouldn't have even considered it. I was a remarkably shy student. Those that know me might be surprised to know that, but there was a wonderful human by the name of Sister Mary Patricia Plum, who quite passionately recruited me to start doing speech and debate in high school and figure out, find my voice. And turns out I do love to debate quite a bit, but taught me a lot. And that's, I think, the beginning of me thinking about going to law school. But I, because of circumstances and timing and my passions as an advocate, wasn't able to pursue that at all. Honestly, my vision for myself in law school was a bit of a selfish one to, I think, redefine the direction in my life, because having to advocate for myself and community became my priority. So law school was quite an exploratory process. And I took advantage of everything Stetson had to offer. I just found it to be a remarkable place with great opportunities for learning and friendships. So I did have a problem saying no. But I really enjoyed that. And no, I could have never envisioned my current role. I would even say, even just a handful of years ago, much less when I was in high school dreaming of someday becoming an attorney, I never would have imagined this role I have right now at all. But I'm grateful to have it today.
Incredible. Awesome. Yeah, I know you do so much for our community. Which kind of leads us into our next question. I'm sure in both your roles, you likely have been in situations where you've had to advocate for others, but also educate at the same time. So what strategies do you use to build a common understanding in your advocating?
The mute button is going to be my enemy probably for the next hour. All right. Some of the common strategies, but very quickly, I just wanted to note that I've known Nathan for several years, and it's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you, my friend. So in terms of the common strategies, where we're working with multiple people to be able to bring them to the table. And it's an opportunity for us to make some acknowledgments in the beginning where there are multiple strategies. And one of the things I wanted to recognize very quickly is, we as advocates, we as moderators, and those trying to help bring people to the table, we have to be authentic in what we're doing. So I'm a huge believer in not necessarily one size fitting all. There's a lot of scholarship. There are several resources that we can explore and I'm using the word we on purpose, that we can explore as we continue to grow and adjust to some of the methods and strategies that are important to us. But in the context of finding the ways that works for you, In general, I find that making some affirmation and laying some ground rules from the very beginning are very important. That allows for each person involved, including myself, to be able to approach a conversation authentically. And in that sense of not being genuine in part of a debate or a conversation, those ground rules can help us get to that point, or find that we all need to take a moment, do some research, have some time for us to collect our thoughts and then come back to the table, because not all conversations, not all time frames are going to be appropriate based on what's happening at one point.
That totally makes sense. Nathan, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. So a couple of strategies. I think it's a never ending learning process. And so I've picked up different strategies as I've moved through different roles. I come from a background in education as a classroom teacher, and I continue to do that, but the audience very much varies. And so the strategies often change as well. So I think about when I was advocating from personal, right, from my perspective is one thing, because that was about me and my moment in time, whatever it was that I might have been advocating for, or even if I was advocating collectively with a community or with a club, a student club. It very much shifted for me when I took the first position I took after law school, which was running an LGBTQ youth center, because now I was advocating from their perspective. And so it presented some challenges, right? Like generationally, language, things didn't mean exactly what they meant to me. And then I was working with folks who were much older than I was, and I was a bit of a bridge. And so there were strategies in that role in that moment. And then the role I'm in right now, I'm publicly representing a statewide elected official. I'm serving a variety of cohorts. I serve all Floridians. So even though my role and my title is specific, it's really not, because all I do all day is education and advocacy, and try and get folks to engage with the state agency that most people don't know beyond, agriculture generally. What does the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services do? And so I give that filter to say that it's the reason, as I've learned through each of these roles, why sometimes I choose, if I know I'm entering a conversation, right? If it's ahead of time, I may or may not do a little bit of background research to be prepared. Sometimes the conversation's spontaneous, right? In that instance, I think my best tool has always been to be open and to listen. And the hardest thing for me, and I'm always working on this because there's so much that I don't know about. I mean, our industry is so much bigger and broader, and the number of divisions with over 4,000 employees, I'm literally learning on the job every day. Is to acknowledge what my perspective might be in that moment. I'm a remarkably proud person sometimes. So admitting when I was younger, admitting what I don't know, which is tough as a professional, right? And coming up with the way to respond into that moment about not understanding something can be embarrassing. But it's very honest, to be able to say, I really don't know a lot about this issue. But I'd love to either know more. You might be in front of someone who could educate you, or you might want to educate yourself. But that also lends to sort of my perspective, creating sometimes a response that could be automatic or a filter. Do I recognize that's actually happening? Do I know how am I showing up in that? And I've realized over the years, I show up differently. And so it's kind of a conscious feedback loop with yourself that you have to be willing to do. So for future attorneys or advocates, or if you're choosing, law degree adjacent sort of career, whether it's you or you're representing your direct supervisor, you're representing an organization, those are very different perspective to sort of do. And sometimes they all collide, and it's a little hard to navigate, but background information, listening, and acknowledging your place within, I think, are the top three that I would. Rule of three, still doing law school there. See what I did, Carmen?
Yeah, no, none of that. This is not that kind of conversation. So what's the difference between being an advocate and an ally? And does one of those have to precede the other before you can be an advocate or an ally? Open question.
Fantastic. Nathan, I would love for you to go first on this one.
Oh, okay.
I
Well,
want you to do it. Yes.
so it's funny. Years ago, I used to say, yes, you have to be an ally first. And I would think, and then as I learned more, right, I in my mind, there was a time when we sort of talked about allyship. And we trained a lot about how to be an ally to all kinds of communities, right? And then there was, this idea maybe of passivity and being an ally. And so how do we become a champion? And there are a lot of different perspectives. And I recently looked this word up because I was thinking about this very question for another training. And the definition, at least the one, I have no source, apologies for this, but is basically like a formal cooperation to do something in partnership for some purpose, right? And that to me says, like, you don't really know what the person's perspective or thought about that might be. If we're advocating, now we're supporting, we're publicly doing something around an issue or a policy, and that's very different. And I think we have a lot of partnerships, which is, maybe a different word for me, that is ally, that we can move in and out of, I think, sort of our perspective. It could be strategic, right? As opposed to being intentional, which is very different. I'm a big advocate for advocates because when you're invested in the conversation, it's different. You show up differently. So that would be sort of I've changed and evolved in my understanding of those, but I don't know about you, Carmen. That's just me.
Thank you. And I thought that was perfect. The reason why I kindly asked you to go first, Nathan, is, because of course, within your space is so essential. And you're in that direct advocacy, you're engaging with the legislature. Of course, I'm in the higher education environment. And so I have some, I recognize that I tend to have some academic definitions. And so I was really curious about the practitioner definitions as well. And you're right, it's going to vary depending on the space in which you're in. And again, that concept of one size doesn't necessarily fit all. Different communities have different forms of allyship or advocacy. And that's, I think, a beautiful part. It is almost a landscape, a tapestry of what it might mean. So what I'll add very briefly is, when we're looking at allyship and advocacy, there's a component of both that involves some education and intention. Where as an ally, some definitions, not all, some definitions will consider an ally to be someone who is lending support, particularly from a position of authority or majority or power. And that could be in the form of a lawyer standing in front of a judge. You're, in that context, but basically lending support from that position of power to someone who may need assistance or who might not have as much power in that particular situation. And in order to do that, of course, you're doing it in a sense of wanting to lend that support and be helpful, but also ideally having some knowledge of why that moment might be impactful. And then advocacy is taking that agency. Usually it requires some form of permission. We can always be advocates, but depending on the group that we're advocating for. Now, of course, if we're advocating on behalf of ourselves, it's something very different. But if we're advocating on behalf of someone else, there is usually some form of permission and preparation, as Nathan has already mentioned before. And whether one goes before the other, I think it really does depend on the community and the circumstance in which that is occurring.
Excellent. Thank you for adding on to that. I like what you said about permission, especially when you're doing it on behalf of other people, because that's so important to have that respect for others and the preparation. I like how they build it off of each other there. All right, next question. I'm sure a lot of people have been in situations where they've witnessed microaggressions, bias, bad jokes or just blatant homophobic, racist, transphobic content. How do you process those feelings? And if you don't say anything in the moment, is there anything you can do after that moment passes?
Yes, I will go very quickly. In those moments, and again, there's this concept that we are all perpetual learners. So I think at outset, we have to sometimes give ourselves permission and grace to be able to acknowledge the things that are happening around us. And there's always going to be moments where we're like, I wish I would have done that better. And in those conversations where you're seeing the microaggressions happen in whatever form, or even macro aggressions happen, I think it comes from a place of humility and understanding that there's always going to be mistakes. There's always going to be some intentional acts as well. And understanding that there are going to be some strategies that you have to explore as a professional. This is not something to do ad hoc and just to see what happens, what you would do in a situation. We as professionals and legal professionals, I think, have a duty to have some competency on how we can not only be within a professional environment because of the stature that lawyers and other professionals have within a community, within a space. There's some agency there. And so some of the conversations that I often have with colleagues, even just among loved ones, are going to be around ways, first acknowledging that there are microaggressions that can happen across the board. And then also taking that humility, that professional humility, to be able to do research, have conversations, listen to narratives that are not your own, and be able to gain an understanding of how these microaggressions may look when they happen, and how to best intercede when needed. Now, sometimes you'll need permission. And sometimes a strategy that I like to utilize is I'll go to that person or even interrupt the conversation and just quietly say to them, "Hi, my name's Carmen," if we don't already know each other. Is there something I can do to help here? And sometimes I've had people tell me, "No, but thank you so much for asking." And then they handle it themselves. And then I've had a couple of times where recently people have said, "Yes, I need some help here." And that's where you're able to be of service, not only to the person who needs that help, but also to the people in the conversation, and being able to direct it and acknowledge what's happening.
Did you have anything you wanted to add on to that, Nathan?
Sure. Is this is a question in and of itself, could be its own presentation. There's a lot to unpack with that. I think what I would add is, I think for me personally, I think very much it would depend in the circumstance. And, I think for different members of different communities, the ability to respond to what may be micro or macroaggressions or expressions of, like expressed or as opposed to implied bias in personal versus professional settings, or what often comes up in humor. Sometimes folks within community will deflect or defer and use humor. That reminds me of often a concern, from a place of safety, right? Or even before safety, just even comfort. And so depending on who is with you in that moment, or who is in that group, there are a lot of, reasons you may or may not, address that. And then that speaks to the second question about when you come back to that conversation, how you do that, right? Because there is a very conscious moment where great learning and great progress can happen in dialogue, and knowing how to approach that for a lot of reason sort of depends on all those things. And I will give one example just from my time in the classroom as an educator or as running the youth center. My students who were much younger really felt, going back to this, idea of being an advocate, felt compelled to stand up and be themselves and be advocates and do so often without a consideration for safety or what the repercussions might be, because developmentally they're still coming into who they are and learning strategies, and don't often take a pause before responding because they're very, very much in the moment, sort of thinking about pre-adolescent 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, and that constant need to explain or respond is it's a lot to carry around for some communities that do that. And sometimes there's an expectation in professional settings when you are a part of some communities like that, you should be the expert that always steps up or steps in or does the education when it happens. So I think that goes back to the advocate or the ally who may be responding, and in what role are they? Are they the one experiencing the results of that, or are they the person who maybe in the moment has the power or the safety to respond to what's happening? And that's not always the same person, if that makes sense. Anyway, Carmen, you might want to circle back on that, but that's where I was thinking about, what would be important to highlight as well.
And very quickly, thank you for that, Nathan. Just to add, Hunter, if I'm allowed, there have been circumstances where I have believed I've seen something, and I felt that it was a safe space to advocate or to be an ally, in that instance, an ally. But I wasn't necessarily sure what the words are or because again, it wasn't my identity, and it was me knowing that something was wrong, something wasn't right, and even looking at the person. And there was a moment for me to be able to speak, because I would have been able to feel comfortable doing so. And I regretted not speaking at that moment. But again, as part of that question, again, giving yourself that permission to do some research of all the things that we can learn about within our communities. The concept of people, I think, is of utmost importance. And so I was able to, kind of do some research to figure out what the nuances were, what were the narratives around this particular circumstance. And then I was able to go back later, both to the individual impacted and then also the person who made the mistake and what it ended up being a true mistake. And so, again, we all have to recognize that we are all perpetual learners. And in that context of being able to navigate these situations in a way that is informed, but then also, we feel safe to be able to speak up when needed. That's going to be one of the key things. So thank you for that, Nathan.
I think that's a great start to answering those questions. I do think that they also deserve their own panel entirely. All right, number 5. In our journey of becoming an effective advocate, we are likely to mess up, that cycle of perpetual learning. What advice do you have for handling situations where we didn't handle it the right way? And what's maybe some of the best practices you found for apologizing in those situations?
I think this is a very short answer for me, but I think it's an acknowledgement. I messed up and I'm sorry. And I think as Carmen was wrapping up the last question, like there's sometimes just sort of a gut check moment. You just know it, like that wasn't right. And I may not know entirely the impact. I don't have all the answers, but I'm like, ooh, and we're human, right? And so I think when we mess up on both sides of that conversation, there is an acknowledgement. I need to acknowledge that I screwed up and own that. And the person accepting that acknowledgement, maybe in the moment, may not want to, right? Depending on what the circumstances, the hurt or the harm may be really significant. But the hope would always be, of course, to also acknowledge it on the receiving end, because that's the moment where progress can happen, you know, in the discourse and in the understanding. And so both sides have to be open. So it may not be in the same moment. It might be a multi-step process. But a lot of us, you know, and I've certainly been, you know, a bit proud in the moment, and I'm a little slow sometimes to recognize that, you know, we can get sort of tunnel, you know, perspective on some things, and we have to sort of step back. And if we're listening to our gut, if it twinges, that's something to really, I think, lean into.
I agree with that 100%. That acknowledgement. And I think the only thing I can add, to be honest, is that concept of authenticity when we can. We might not be able to make it in the moment, because sometimes when we make those mess ups or those mishaps, mistakes, there's a reason why. It's because maybe we didn't know, we weren't as educated in that moment as we should have been. So apologizing in the moment, if possible. There have been absolutely moments when I didn't even realize it at the time, but a day after, 2 days after, either it strikes me in the gut and you rethink the moment, or someone kindly tells you, hey, you could have been better in that moment. And I appreciate those people who do that. But if you're able to also, with an apology or with that acknowledgement, whatever works in that particular moment and circumstance, to go a little bit further and say, not only do I acknowledge my mistake, but and again, you keep hearing me say the word research. Maybe it's a science background, or I don't know, but have that concept and be able to say that to the person and say, I am sorry. And here's some of the things that I've been looking into to better learn about whatever the circumstance may have been. I've seen that can go a long way, because sometimes the apology might not be accepted. Let's be honest. But that is still an opportunity for you to at least acknowledge that not only do I acknowledge the error, but I want to do better. And I want to learn about the narrative or the cause or the circumstance that I can do better next time.
I think that's so important. Not just learning about something, but knowing that you want to do better in the future at what you messed up on. Yeah, short question, but a hard one for sure. All right. When tactics are used by other people in conversations where you feel like your side's maybe being gaslit, or you're being overwhelmed by tactics that try to divert the conversation from the facts of the issue, how can you bring it back to maybe a civil place, or what you're kind of trying to get your point across as?
Yeah, this is a good one. I think you got to be really honest with yourself about the purpose of why you're in that conversation in that moment to begin with. So this, for me, the work I do is always personal, but if I'm in a particular setting, right, and if it's a professional setting, which I think when you're in a professional school, if you're in law school, or if you're with an employer, or even serving as a volunteer within an organization, those are all professional settings. Like, we're not in the backyard at the barbecue. How does this thing that's happening fit into it? Because those conversations can really start to spiral, and it ceases. There is nothing productive that's sort of happening, right? So I think sometimes someone has to be sort of the person that maybe pause it. Right now I feel like so many conversations, there's just tenseness. As soon as the tenseness happens as soon as you walk in the room or via Zoom. As soon as you are on the screen, right? I represent the state. I have this visual here in branding, and someone could see that, and I could be in a conversation, and it may or may not mean that I'm doing work for the LGBT community. It could just be pretty colors because it's a rainbow. But my title, when I'm introduced, folks can sometimes just sort of tense up and say, LGBTQ, what does that mean? And so there's immediate resistance that may even change the conversation before it starts. So if you're in it and that resistance is happening, then everything that's happening is based on attention, right? And so, you know, the ability to minimize that has to be frankly done on both sides, because if it isn't, it just is going to, you know, it's going to fail either way, right? You have to sort of collectively agree to keep it in that space. And that's really hard to do right now. But you mentioned earlier, Carmen, sort of coming into conversations with some agreements. If you do that and understand when this moment happens, we will agree to step away. And a lot of this is like diplomacy 101. And so you never think, well, did we think we would need like this, you know, sort of international skill set in everyday life? Well, we kind of do, because we are in such a charged, divisive world right now that we have to apply those skills in the everyday.
Absolutely. And I think what I can contribute there is, you know, there's a lot of scholarship within psychology that talks about a concept of cognitive immunology or immunization, where we are, and I'm using the word we very generally in terms of, you know, human beings. Of course, we all are in different places and different, you know, in different spaces in terms of how we do this. But in the crux of it, we all have moments where if something we feel is going against our beliefs or what we think, it makes us uncomfortable. There's a natural reaction to want to reject it. So if someone is making a point and they're saying, this is what I think in this situation, and this is how it impacts me, there are, of course, going to be moments where we feel that them shifting the conversation to want to focus on them is somehow an attack or an antithesis to us and what we feel. So sometimes when I hear those deflections, again, it's not across the board, one size doesn't fit all, but I'm immediately thinking that person who's doing the deflection is saying, well, what about me? And not all the time, but when we're talking about difficult conversations, I think that's a moment where you stop and you just call it out in the moment and saying, I understand that you're trying to shift the conversation to focus on something that you care about. But in this moment, I'm talking about me, or I'm talking about my client, or I'm talking about this particular subject matter. So while what you're saying has value, and I do want to listen, shift the conversation back to what I'm talking about. And if that is something that we can agree upon, and Nathan made a very crucial point that it has to be mutual, because that person can continue on talking about whatever that they were trying to do or change or deflect the conversation towards. And that's probably a moment to walk away. But calling it out in that moment and being able to acknowledge what they're saying and then say, that is a conversation that I value and I would love to have it. But at this point, I am talking about this particular narrative, and I would like to be able to hear a response on your thought about what I'm saying.
Walk it out, call it out. I got it. So how do you handle situations when someone's identity or experience is invalidated? And where's the line in advocating for someone else when the other party is also advocating for themselves? And how can we avoid, you know, overstepping? And I think we've kind of touched on this, but can we elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So sort of like a general approach, and then you know, I have this in my life every day. And my title is, you know, that I'm an advocate. And so I'll give an example with parents. I work with so many parents over the years, especially at the youth center. And when parents would come into an understanding and embrace their kids and they're super excited, they'd be like, no one is a bigger champion than parents, right? And sometimes it happens with, you know, educators and allies of lots of communities when you have this awareness, this awakening, and you recognize I have a passion to support this community, sometimes that energy seems to take over the room than actually the community or the person that you're trying to elevate, right? And so there's this idea of like speaking up but not over who you're serving. And there's a delicate balance in that. And so I think that's first, sort of a personal check to sort of make sure. And then this goes back a little bit to the permission piece. I often have people contact me asking me to advocate for them. And they lead and drive that process. They must. It is the personal. It is, grounded in the local. It is about that human, which is tough because sometimes you see in movements, bigger things happen and the individual gets a little bit lost. And so that's a balance as, future attorneys too. You're there winning a case, but it is about a human in the center of that, right? So when there's a difficult conversation to have and someone is invalidated or erased, it's more. So my students, another example from the youth center years, because the more recent examples, I must keep in confidence, but I would have students come forward and say, hey, something happened at school. It could have been a middle school or a high school, and I don't know what to do about it. And I said, well, we could talk about it. Do you want me to help? Do you want me to give you some tools? Would you like me to call your, GSA sponsor, or would you like me to go with you for the meeting? Do you want, your parents to go on your behalf? There are lots of options, but the person, who's sort of centered in that conversation is learning as a part of the process as well. And I think that becomes very important because going back to sort of safety and all the things, maybe it's going to take some time to get to the place where, you really want to go forward, and you have to recognize that. And sometimes, a great ally will come in and help with the situation and not always let the person who they're advocating for know. And that sometimes can be awkward, appreciated, but awkward. That has certainly happened in my life. That happened in law school. And that's okay. But I think, again, you have to, it's about, the human. And so you have to speak up for, but not over that individual.
And very quickly, Nathan, in a world where, people not speaking up has been just as harmful as, the harm itself, I think there should be that acknowledgement that, yes, you don't want to overstep, you don't want to act without permission, but even as a receiver of that type of allyship or advocacy, again, understanding someone's intent at that moment. But with that being said, I think, and again, just emphasizing that concept of permission, there's a difference between speaking up and then versus speaking on behalf. Speaking on behalf is a completely different concept. And you absolutely want to have permission in that conversation with someone, as opposed, when we're talking about speaking on their behalf, especially if they're not present. But in the concept of speaking up, I think we all should have agency in doing so when comfortable, as Nathan has said, when we feel safe to do so, when we feel empowered. But in the construct of being able to have that type of allyship and advocacy in order to stop that invalidation, and sometimes not even speaking to the group who's doing the invalidating, but turning to that individual and saying, hey, Nathan, that point you just made was outstanding. Outstanding. And then drawing the conversation back to that, because I think we've all experienced, or maybe many people have experienced, that example of you saying an idea or you saying something to a group and then them bypassing it, but then someone else who, for whatever reason, variety of reason, that group values more, says the same thing or rewords it, and then all of a sudden, oh, what a great idea. In that moment, that's an opportunity for that person to say, well, Nathan just said that, so let's go back to what Nathan. And Nathan, can you please elaborate on this great point that you already just made?
Awesome. I know we're coming down to the end of our time, and I want to provide space for Q&A at the end. But I do have two more questions. Nathan, I wanted to give you some space to talk about the Don't Say Gay bill, because last time we talked, you were on your way to Tallahassee. I'd love to, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the bill, what you did on it, and how you think that that might affect the school system if it gets through litigation.
Sure. Yes, I spent most of the 60 or so days, last 60 days, from January 11th to March 11th, 14th in Tallahassee. Session was extended a couple of days, but yeah, so the HB 1557, coined in media as the Don't Say Gay bill, took quite a national and international place. The media attention was significant, and a lot of that was because so many individuals engaged with government. In my role, one, I'm as the consumer advocate concerned about the impacts for all Floridians or anyone who comes into our state and spends money, whether it's through businesses or in supporting nonprofits. So it's pretty much anybody, everybody. The number one business to the state of Florida, of course, is tourism. Number two is agriculture. And so our agency and the commissioner, and then as an employer with more than 4,000 employees too, we're very invested in this discussion. I think the most beautiful aspect, before I get into the legislation itself, I have never seen so many humans engage elected officials, either locally or in Tallahassee. Week after week, organizations came on both sides of the bill, proponents and opponents, to have their voices heard. Far more opponents to the bill came up. The LGBT community and their allies came up. Students came up and engaged. So we saw all these questions and what we're talking about. I saw that play out in committee, certainly testified in committee, on the House floor, on the Senate floor, and in legislators' offices as constituents hope to meet with folks and understand better why they were making the decisions they were making. Ultimately, it passed. It has not gone to the governor's desk yet. Once it does, it has 15 days to either be signed or not. But in essence, what passed is not exactly what started. So in state law, we don't have this expression primary education or primary school. So we did narrow very much through the discussion K through 3, but there is still this vague language around age appropriateness. We also narrowed this idea of classroom discussion to classroom instruction, but again, very vague terms that, lawyers will certainly litigate, because from an application standpoint, it doesn't really tell folks who would be concerned with this law, which would be school personnel, both school districts and classroom teachers, what it means. And so that is yet to be determined. But I would say the impact has been immediate. There are school districts responding to this and educators responding to this in a variety of ways. There are some that are concerned and changing their syllabus. There are some districts that will be very vocal and have been very vocal to stand up and support LGBTQ students. But I think in essence, the discourse, if you step back and look at this, very much had to do with a lot of misinformation coming in very quickly. And there were some really substantive conversations that happened. Those may not have been as public as they could have been. I think you saw that happen as 9 Republicans did end up voting against it, either in committee or on the floor. But there's a difference between, political discourse and other discourse, right? So I want to sort of separate, politicians doing what they do versus policy discussions or research-based discussions. And so there's a bit of theater, and that's understood, and sometimes that gets sort of lost. But on the ground, the impacts are already starting to be felt. And the research tells us what those impacts may be long-term. And unfortunately, that means students being harmed and outcomes being more negative than positive. And so I'm hopeful that these tough conversations are going to continue. But it's going to take a lot of what we've talked about in the last 50 or so minutes to make that happen, for sure. And there's some other legislation, including HB 7, that was also passed, the Stop Woke Act, that's going to have implications in both educational and employment situations as well. But I just want to flag that as well. So.
So
And-
kind of, go ahead.
I wanted to hop in real quick, and I wanted to share that we do have some student questions, and it ties directly into what Nathan was just talking about. So Hunter, is it a good time at this moment? All right. So the one question that we received, which kind of dovetails on what you were speaking about, Nathan, is how can we advocate against these laws, against having conversations about race, LGBTQ issues in public schools, like the Don't Say Gay bill and the anti-critical race theory bill. So what are things that we as a community can be doing? Obviously, the legislative session is over. Right now, it's going to the governor's desk. So what can we do next?
Sure. Great question, Joanne. Thank you for that. So it hasn't been signed yet. I think we sort of, expect the governor to sign it. He's made public statements about that, but you can certainly contact the governor by phone or email. I think the next step, though, is continuing the outreach and the education, because what this bill does mean, there are a lot of things it doesn't mean, for example. So like GSA clubs in school settings, the need for supporting LGBTQ students and ultimately empowering them still exists. The best practices based on research, those all exist. And so we have to make sure communities continue to feel supported and educators and school districts continue to remain supported to do the work. And then I would say, as somebody who is encouraging always civic engagement with our state agencies and with our electeds, there's an accountability factor, right? So if you found that the human that represents you didn't vote your concern and didn't speak for you, you have to let them know. And ultimately, I'm always about getting folks engaged in voting. There's an election this year, and there's a lot of ways to get involved with that work as well. And so, laws, there's laws change. And I think, based on, and we're not getting into a conversation around case law, but I think if we look at where LGBTQ protections are going, and if we look at both Obergefell and Bostock, we know where the law has already told us equality exists and where we have work to do. And so this very much creates tension between the state and Title IX protections. I think we're going to see a lot of Office of Civil Rights complaints with the U.S. Department of Education as well. And so letting folks know that's a resource. If a student feels discriminated against, file a complaint. And the OCR has said quite publicly, we will stand up for our rights as granted federally for our students. So I think those are a lot of options. Education, outreach, accountability, know your resources.
I promised that I would turn off the recording when we asked the question part, and I apologize that I did not do that. But I can edit out that question. I do think it was a valuable resource, so I'll reflect on it. I was thinking more of the personal questions would be edited out, and I commit to doing that. But I am going to stop the recording now so that we can get to questions.